Nobody really wins by following the rules here. And yet, everyone keeps signing. At 3 a.m. in front of a frozen screen and a 200-page contract, Mark DeLatra, a sports lawyer, realizes that Miami has just stolen a game nobody played. Mark, whose name has been recreated for narrative purposes, is combing through a file on college football TV rights for a client. He expects a classic tug-of-war between Florida State, Clemson, and the ACC. He finds something else. Dry lines. An obscure paragraph. A commitment through 2036. And in the middle, a sentence that turns a simple conference into a prison and into a safe for Miami. On his desk, Mark lines up 3 sheets. On the first, projected future revenues for the SEC. On the second, those of the Big Ten. On the third, the ACC. The numbers nosedive. In August 2019, the ACC network launches with ESPN. For the smaller schools, it's survival. For the bigger ones, it's a leash. Florida State and Clemson signed the same grant of rights as Boston College or Wake Forest. Same lock. Same padlock. Except that this lock, if it holds until 2036, condemns the 2 powerhouses and guarantees Miami one monstrously simple thing. No bigger program will be able to poach it from the ACC without blowing up the bank. Mark puts down his pen. He knows the official version. Hypothesis A, the reassuring one, the one everyone repeats in the conference hallways. The ACC did what everyone does. Secure its members, its revenues, the visibility of its network. A long-term contract with ESPN, equal revenue sharing, a grant of rights that locks in media rights so nobody bolts to the SEC at the first gust of wind. Florida State and Clemson played along, cashed the checks, enjoyed the airtime. Miami, for its part, didn't rob anything. The school signed the same paper as the others, accepted the same constraints. In that story, there are no victims, no thieves, just a collective pact. That version blows up in a single sentence when Mark calculates what FSU and Clemson would lose, year after year, compared to the SEC, while Miami remains protected by the same lock, but without being the ones smashing it in court. The gap becomes concrete. Hypothesis B, more twisted. What if the real play wasn't in the signing, but in the timing and the silence? The ACC is fighting to keep the contract through 2036. Florida State opens hostilities in Florida, then Clemson in South Carolina. The headlines talk about unconscionable, about disproportionate penalties, about shackled freedom. The ACC clings to North Carolina, to its jurisdiction clauses, to what it presents as a clear agreement. In all this noise, Miami mounts no public legal offensive. It doesn't expose itself in court, doesn't spend millions in fees trying to break the system. It lets FSU and Clemson bash their heads against the grant of rights. Mark lines up the elements. As long as the GOR holds, the ACC keeps control of FSU and Clemson's TV rights, even if they leave. As long as they don't leave, they remain handcuffed to a deal that pays less than the SEC or the Big Ten. And who benefits the most from a landscape where the 2 programs that attract the SEC and the Big Ten are stuck in a legal war, unable to move quickly, with a revenue gap that eats away at them? A historically glamorous program in a huge market, whose past sells on TV as well as its present. Miami. The contrast takes shape. Mark starts to doubt. Maybe Miami's rise has nothing to do with titles on the field anymore, but with sitting in the right prison, while others are trying to smash the door open with their heads. Hypothesis C, the truly disturbing one. What if the biggest heist wasn't just that Miami benefits from the trap, but that, structurally, the entire system was designed so that a few brands like Miami could thrive precisely because giants like FSU and Clemson are nailed to a long-term ruinous model. The heist would no longer be one school against another. It would be a TV deal using everyone to sanctify a chosen few showcases. And then everything Mark thought he understood about winners in college football flips. He leaves the file open. The next day, Mark walks into a glass-walled conference room on the top floor of a firm in Charlotte. Outside, the city looks like any other American metropolis. Inside, the faces carry the same tension as a sideline with 15 seconds left. Around the table, representatives from universities that don't want their names out. A lawyer from a mid-level ACC school asks him in a neutral voice, "So, are we stuck or not?" Mark opens his laptop, but that's not where the real block is. He realized it the previous night while rereading the file about Maryland's move to the Big Ten. The conference had gone on the attack, demanding a crazy exit fee. Result? A lawsuit, years of friction, a final bill brought down to a little over $30 million, far from the ACC's initial dreams. That precedent has inoculated everyone. This time, the conference no longer wants to lose face. It needs to show broadcasters, other members, and future recruits like Stanford or SMU that a signed contract remains a closed chain. The wall is not legal, it's political. Only one breaking point: the ACC's panicked fear of becoming the next Pac-12, emptied of its flagship members. If FSU or Clemson get out on the cheap, the other major programs will look at the SEC and the Big Ten differently. The lawyers can argue excessive penalty, old contestable clause, but everyone knows what is really at stake. If the court breaks the lock, it's the very model of the grant of rights that starts to wobble across the country. In the room, someone slides a binder that's too heavy, and it hits the bone of Mark's wrist. The pain is sharp, acute, almost ridiculous, and yet that's exactly it. A small jolt that reminds him that behind the PowerPoints, there are bodies, salaries, university presidencies, 10 million a year coaches who can suddenly find themselves coaching in a lower league. Mark lays out the only thing that matters. If the ACC gives in on the grant of rights, the broadcasters will renegotiate the deals. ESPN put money down on stability through 2036, not on an improvised alignment where the headliners run away. The other conferences are watching. The Big 12, which has its own GOR, needs the ACC to hold. The slightest weakening in court, and suddenly every major university can send in its lawyers to test the limits. That's the wall. It doesn't just protect the ACC, it protects a national order. FSU knows it, Clemson knows it, but they no longer have the luxury of waiting. The projected revenue gap with the SEC and the Big Ten is not a theoretical line. In FSU's internal budgets, red columns are starting to appear in the 5-year projections. Facilities to renovate, staffs to expand, NIL to fund, everything rests on one promise: we'll find a way to fill the hole. The ACC, for its part, responds with symbolic gestures, far-flung expansions towards Stanford and Cal, speeches about national footprint. Nothing that makes up for a contract locked in until 2036. For Mark, the wall takes shape in a sentence an administrator slipped him off the record. We have to choose whether we want to die fast by leaving or slowly by staying. He can't quote it, but his whole reasoning depends on it. This is not a battle over contract interpretation. It's a choice between two ways of losing. And it's precisely in this dead end that Miami has settled. Comfortable, almost untouchable. Miami doesn't have the same urgency as FSU or Clemson. Fewer recent titles to defend, but a brand, a market, a history that still sells subscriptions to broadcasters. As long as the ACC exists with its big names, the dedicated channel retains value. As long as other programs are fighting it out in court, Miami can invest in its facilities, its recruiting, its NIL deals, without having to bankroll a legal war across 3 states. That evening, as he leaves the room, Mark still feels the pain in his wrist. A little bruise will appear. Nothing, on the scale of the billions at stake, but enough to remind him that this story can't be resolved with a "they just shouldn't have signed." The only reason no one is really moving, neither FSU nor Clemson, nor the ACC, is this invisible wall. The national TV rights order that no one wants to be the first to officially crack. And in the middle of it all, Miami waits. Time is working in its favor. The sports rights experts Mark interviews almost all reach the same conclusion. On paper, a well-drafted grant of rights, backed by a major broadcaster, remains extremely difficult to break before its term. A lawyer specializing in public law quietly adds nuance in private. The status of public universities like FSU or Clemson, depending on the state, opens potential loopholes regarding the duration and scope of their commitment, which could allow, in the long run, a less costly exit than expected. But what these experts refuse to acknowledge publicly is their shared fear that if a court dissects this type of contract too much, the entire college football economy will tip into a kind of permanent free market where no TV rights deal is really secure beyond a few years. That scenario shadows them. Back to Mark's screen. On the left, Florida State's complaint, with its frontal attacks against the grant of rights and the withdrawal fee deemed outrageous. On the right, Clemson's, more surgical, dissecting every word of the contract to try to limit the scope of the rights assignment after a departure. In the middle, the ACC's statements, calm on the surface, seething underneath. For years, Mark had believed in a simple story. The big schools create the value, the small ones ride along behind, the conferences try to balance it. The one that generates the most audience eventually joins the richest conference. A kind of natural market gravity. What he sees now is something else. FSU and Clemson, major programs, recent champions, are tied to a contract that favors the stability of the structure over their own economic interest. The real gravity isn't the size of the program, it's the strength of the paper. And in this system, Miami has just been propelled to a level it doesn't yet need to justify with recent trophies. The ACC needs enticing showcases to sell to ESPN, especially if two of its heavyweights are going up in legal flames. Miami checks all the boxes: gigantic market, cultural legacy, explosive potential if the dollars finally flow at the right scale. As long as FSU and Clemson are bogged down in courts in Florida, North Carolina, and South Carolina, the internal balance of power shifts. What Mark believed to be true collapses. He thought a heist in college football was a program fleeing to a more lucrative contract by smashing a buyout clause with lawyers. Here, the heist works in reverse. Miami didn't blow the safe. It let the others crash into it until the ACC realized that it already had, in-house, a brand capable of serving as a flagship without demanding an exit ticket. What remains instead is darker and narrower. The ambitions of FSU and Clemson no longer depend only on their results on the field, nor even on what the SEC or the Big Ten want. They depend on a judge willing to take the risk of destabilizing a national economic model. They also depend on the fear of other university presidents who look at their own grant of rights and say to themselves, if we let that one fall, ours will be next. Sports, suddenly, looks more like a succession of clauses and competent forums than like third and long and Hail Marys. For Miami, the realization is almost cynical. The school discovers it can become central again without having yet won what, in the old world, granted the right to speak loudly. Not because it cheated, not because it set up a secret plan, but because a rigid system mechanically generates unexpected winners. The more the cage closes in on FSU and Clemson, the more the ACC, ESPN, and the market look toward the remaining programs that can embody a sellable future. And there, the U logo naturally appears. Mark remains stuck on a question, cracking like a slap in the silence of his office. In a college football world governed by locked-in TV contracts, does the field still have the power to decide who truly deserves to be at the top? In an almost empty stadium, very early in the morning, Miami's turf is still damp, the white lines half erased by the dew. A cleaning crew slowly pushes a metal cart that squeaks on the concrete. In the distance, a giant screen silently loops a highlight of an old title, oversaturated colors, slightly grainy image. On the sideline, a stack of printed pages, forgotten on a plastic chair, rustles at every draft without anyone picking it up. Day will eventually break.